Margaret Miller wasn't merely an elderly woman living alone in a rural Ohio town. She was a living testament to a life well lived but marked by immense loss. At 78, Margaret spent most of her days in her modest, weathered farmhouse, a place she and her late husband, John, had called home for over 50 years. The house stood at the end of a gravel road, its white paint peeling and its porch swaying gently in the breeze. It was surrounded by fields that stretched endlessly, punctuated only by the occasional oak tree or a wandering deer. Her days followed a rhythm of quiet routine. She'd wake early, guided by the soft chimes of an old alarm clock. After carefully transferring herself from her bed to her wheelchair, she would maneuver her way to the kitchen. The smell of coffee brewing brought a small comfort, a habit she'd carried on since John's passing. Photographs adorned the walls of her kitchen. John in his Navy uniform, her children as toddlers, and her beloved German shepherd, Max, whose companionship had been her solace after John's death. But now, Max was gone too, and the house felt emptier than ever. The silence was profound, broken only by the hum of her old fridge or the distant chirping of birds. Margaret had Alzheimer's, and though her condition was still in its early stages, the disease had begun stealing fragments of her memories. Some days, she'd forget that John was gone, calling out his name only to be met by the aching realization that he wasn't there. Other times, she would smile, lost in a moment from the past, unaware that it had slipped away. Lisa, her caretaker, was her only regular visitor. Every Thursday at precisely 9 a.m., Lisa's red sedan would pull into the driveway, a sight that Margaret both anticipated and dreaded. Lisa was in her early 40s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. Her presence was a lifeline for Margaret, though Margaret would never admit it outright. On one such Thursday, Lisa arrived as usual, carrying a grocery bag in one hand and a bouquet of daisies in the other. "Morning, Margaret," Lisa called out as she stepped through the front door, the screen door creaking behind her. Margaret, seated in her wheelchair by the window, turned her head and smiled faintly. "Oh, John, you're finally home," she said, her voice laced with a mix of hope and confusion. Lisa set the groceries down, her expression softening. "It's me, Lisa. Margaret. Let's get you some breakfast, okay?" Margaret's face fell slightly, but she nodded. "All right, dear. But John will be back soon, won't he?" Lisa didn't answer immediately. She'd learned that sometimes it was kinder to go along with Margaret's memories than to confront her with reality. "Maybe later," she said gently, arranging the daisies in a vase. The farmhouse itself was a reflection of Margaret's state of mind. Once meticulously maintained, it now bore the marks of time and neglect. The porch steps were uneven, the paint was chipped, and the garden beds were overgrown. Inside, the furniture was worn but sturdy, and the smell of lavender, Margaret's favorite scent, lingered faintly. Despite the isolation and her illness, Margaret found moments of solace in the little things. The warmth of the sun streaming through her lace curtains, the sound of rain tapping against the roof, and the memories that Alzheimer's hadn't yet taken from her. But those moments were fleeting. Most days, loneliness settled over her like a heavy blanket, reminding her of everything she had lost. "I miss him, you know," Margaret said softly one afternoon, her gaze fixed on the fields beyond the window. Lisa, busy tidying up the living room, paused and turned to her. "I know, Margaret, but you're not alone. I'm here." Margaret smiled faintly. For now, the simplicity of her life belied the depth of her emotions. Every photograph, every piece of furniture, every crack in the wall held a story that Margaret clung to, even as the edges of her mind grew blurry. As another day faded into twilight, Margaret wheeled herself onto the porch, the cool evening air brushing against her face. She looked out at the fields, the horizon bathed in hues of orange and pink. For a moment, she felt John's presence, as if he were sitting beside her. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Good night, my love." The house stood quiet and still, waiting for the next chapter of Margaret's life to unfold. An unexpected chapter that neither she nor anyone else could have foreseen. It was an unusually warm spring morning in Margaret's little corner of Ohio. The sun filtered through the thin, white curtains in her bedroom, casting delicate patterns on the wooden floor. Margaret stirred in her bed, her hand instinctively reaching for the empty space beside her. She blinked, confused for a moment, until reality settled back in. John was gone. With a sigh, she pushed herself upright and began her slow, careful routine to start the day. She made her way to the front porch, where her wheelchair was always parked next to the old swing. The porch faced the gravel road and the sprawling fields beyond, a view Margaret loved despite the memories it sometimes unearthed. She clutched a steaming mug of coffee in her hands, its aroma momentarily transporting her back to mornings she used to share with John. The rhythmic creak of the porch swing was the only sound until a faint rustling caught her attention. Margaret squinted toward the gate at the edge of her property. There, just outside the fence, stood a dog, a pitbull, to be exact. He was large, muscular, and his brown coat gleamed in the sunlight. The dog was still, staring at her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Yet, there was something familiar in his gaze, something that reminded her of Max, her late German shepherd. Margaret set her coffee down on the small table beside her. "Well, who are you, boy?" she murmured aloud. The dog tilted his head slightly, his ears twitching at the sound of her voice. For a moment, Margaret hesitated. A pit bull. The breed had a reputation, one she'd heard about countless times on the evening news. But as she looked closer, she noticed the softness in his eyes, a gentleness that contradicted his imposing stature. Margaret leaned forward slightly in her chair, her voice more confident this time. "Max, is that you?" The dog didn't move, but continued to watch her. Something stirred in her chest, a mix of longing and curiosity. Without thinking, she reached for the latch on the gate. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the effort. As the gate swung open with a groan, the dog didn't run or bark. Instead, he took a cautious step forward, his tail swaying gently from side to side. "That's it," Margaret said softly, her tone coaxing. "Come on, boy." The dog approached her slowly, his head low, as if sensing her frailty. When he reached her, Margaret extended a hand. The dog sniffed it cautiously before pressing his warm nose into her palm. "Good boy," she whispered, stroking his head. His fur was surprisingly soft, and as she touched him, memories of Max came rushing back. His loyalty, his unwavering presence during her darkest days. The dog sat beside her chair, his large frame nearly level with her knees. Margaret chuckled, the sound surprising even herself. "Well, you've certainly made yourself at home," she said. "What should I call you, huh? Max?" "No, you're not Mac." She paused, her gaze drifting over the dog's muscular form. "Buddy. I think you look like a buddy." The dog wagged his tail at the sound of the name, as if approving her choice. As the morning wore on, Margaret found herself talking to Buddy, sharing fragments of her life as if he were an old friend. She told him about John, about Max, and about the loneliness that had settled over her like a fog. Buddy listened in silence, his eyes never leaving hers. When Lisa arrived later that morning, she was startled to find a pit bull lounging on the porch beside Margaret. "Margaret!" Lisa exclaimed, stepping out of her car. "What on earth is that dog doing here?" Margaret looked up, a smile tugging at her lips. "Lisa, meet Buddy. He showed up this morning, like he knew I needed him." Lisa frowned, eyeing the dog warily. "A pit bull? Margaret, you have to be careful. You don't know where he came from or if he's dangerous." Margaret's expression turned firm, her hand resting on Buddy's head. "He's not dangerous. He's special. I can feel it." Lisa sighed, recognizing the stubborn determination in Margaret's tone. "All right," she said finally, "but we need to be cautious. I'll call the shelter later to see if anyone's reported a missing dog." Margaret nodded, but deep down, she already knew Buddy wasn't going anywhere. The days after Buddy's arrival felt different for Margaret. The silence that had once engulfed her house was replaced by the soft sound of paws on the wooden floors and the occasional jingle of Buddy's makeshift collar, a piece of twine Margaret had tied around his neck until she could find something better. His presence was grounding, almost as if he'd always been there. One afternoon, as Margaret sat in her usual spot on the porch, Buddy lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws. The sun cast a golden glow over the fields, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass. Margaret absent-mindedly stroked Buddy's fur, her fingers tracing the smooth lines of his ears. "You know," she began, her voice soft, "when Max was here, I never felt lonely. He was always by my side, even when John passed. Losing him was like losing the last piece of my old life." Buddy looked up at her, his amber eyes filled with something Margaret couldn't quite name. Understanding, perhaps, or simply the quiet acceptance that dogs seem to master so effortlessly. Later that week, Lisa arrived for her regular visit, her arms full of groceries. She found Margaret and Buddy in the living room. Margaret was humming a tune, something Lisa hadn't heard her do in years. "Margaret, you seem different," Lisa said, setting the groceries down on the counter. Margaret smiled, glancing at Buddy. "He's good company," she admitted. "It's like having Max back, but not quite. He's his own dog." Lisa approached cautiously, kneeling beside Buddy. "Well, he seems to have settled in. But Margaret, I still think we should find out where he came from." Margaret's smile faltered. "He came to me," she said firmly. "Does it matter where he was before?" Lisa hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but at least let me take him to the vet, just to make sure he's healthy." Margaret relented, though the thought of Buddy leaving her side, even for a short time, filled her with unease. The vet visit revealed that Buddy was in excellent health, though he wasn't microchipped, and no one had reported a missing dog matching his description. Lisa returned him to Margaret with a new collar, this one a sturdy blue leather strap with a simple silver tag engraved with his new name, Buddy. The bond between Margaret and Buddy deepened quickly. He seemed to sense her needs before she voiced them. When she struggled to pick up something she dropped, Buddy would nudge it toward her with his nose. When she grew frustrated with her forgetfulness, he would rest his head on her lap, his calm presence soothing her frayed nerves. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Margaret sat on the porch, her hands clasped tightly together. She stared out at the fields, her expression distant. "Sometimes, I think I'm losing pieces of myself," she admitted aloud. "Little bits of who I was. It's terrifying." Buddy, lying beside her, sat up and pressed his head against her arm. Margaret chuckled softly, tears glistening in her eyes. "You always know, don't you?" The connection between them wasn't just about companionship, it was about healing. Buddy's unwavering loyalty filled the void that Alzheimer's had begun carving into Margaret's life. As the weeks passed, Buddy became a fixture not just in Margaret's home, but also in her routine. She began venturing out into her overgrown garden, encouraged by Buddy's playful energy. Together, they cleared away weeds, planted daisies, her favorite flower, and spent hours soaking in the sun. When neighbors passed by, they often stopped to greet the dog. "That your new pup, Margaret?" one man called from the road. Margaret straightened in her wheelchair, her hand resting proudly on Buddy's head. "This is Buddy," she replied. "He found me." The neighbor nodded approvingly. "Looks like a good one." Margaret smiled. "He is." It was a simple exchange, but it marked a shift. Buddy wasn't just a stray anymore. He was hers, and she was his. As dusk fell that evening, Margaret wheeled herself back inside, Buddy following close behind. She paused at the threshold, glancing down at him. "Good night, Buddy," she said softly. Buddy wagged his tail, settling down beside her chair as she turned off the lights. The house, though still quiet, no longer felt empty. Margaret didn't know it yet, but Buddy's presence was about to be tested in a way that would change both their lives forever. The night began like any other. Margaret had completed her usual evening routine, tidying up the living room, brushing her teeth, and double-checking that the back door was locked. She wheeled herself to the small bedroom she had shared with John for decades. Buddy followed her, his nails clicking softly against the wooden floor. Margaret settled into bed, pulling the heavy quilt up to her chin. She glanced at Buddy, who had curled up on a rug near the foot of the bed. "Good night, Buddy," she said softly, her voice filled with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. Buddy lifted his head briefly, his amber eyes meeting hers, before resting it back down on his paws. Outside, The quiet of the rural night stretched over the fields like a thick blanket. The occasional chirp of crickets was the only sound, but somewhere in the distance, danger lurked. It was well past midnight when Buddy's ears perked up, his body tensed, and he rose to his feet, alert. Margaret, still half asleep, didn't notice at first, but when Buddy let out a low growl, she opened her eyes. "What is it, boy?" she whispered groggily, her hand reaching for the bedside lamp. Buddy didn't move from his spot, his gaze fixed on the bedroom door. The growl deepened, reverberating through the small room. Margaret's heart began to race. She hadn't heard anything yet, but Buddy's behavior was enough to send a chill down her spine. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, but as her fingers brushed against it, she froze. A faint noise, metal scraping against metal, echoed from the back door. "Oh, Lord," Margaret murmured under her breath. Her hands trembled as she picked up the phone and dialed 911. "911, what's your emergency?" The operator's calm voice answered. "There's someone trying to break into my house," Margaret whispered, her voice shaking. "I'm alone and I can't." Buddy's bark interrupted her. It was loud, sharp, and filled with warning. "Ma'am, stay on the line. Officers are on their way," the operator assured her. Margaret clutched the phone to her chest, her other hand gripping the wheels of her chair. In the kitchen, two shadows moved carefully, their voices hushed. "Just grab whatever you can find," one of them said, his tone impatient. The other man hesitated, glancing toward the hallway. "What about the old lady? I heard she's in a wheelchair." "Forget her," the first man snapped. "She can't do anything." They didn't know about Buddy. As the intruders crept closer, Buddy positioned himself in the hallway, blocking the path to Margaret's room. His bark grew louder, echoing through the house like a warning siren. One of the men froze. "What the hell is that?" "It's just a dog," the other replied, though his voice wavered. "Come on." Buddy lunged the moment the first man stepped into the hallway. His growl turned into a snarl as he grabbed hold of the man's pant leg, pulling him down with surprising force. "Get him off me," the man yelled, struggling to free himself. The second intruder hesitated, torn between helping his accomplice and fleeing. In the chaos, Margaret wheeled herself to the bedroom door, her phone still in hand. "Leave my house," she shouted, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. The second man turned toward her, his eyes narrowing. "Stay out of this, lady," he growled, taking a step closer. Buddy released the first man and turned his attention to the second, positioning himself protectively in front of Margaret. He barked again, louder this time, and the sound was enough to send the second intruder running. The first man, still on the floor, scrambled to his feet and bolted after his partner, leaving behind a shoe that Buddy had ripped off in the struggle. Moments later, red and blue lights flashed through the windows as the sound of sirens filled the air. Officers stormed the house, guns drawn, but the intruders were already gone. Margaret pointed toward the back door. "They ran that way," she said, her voice shaky but firm. One of the officers knelt beside her. "Are you all right, ma'am?" Margaret nodded, her hand resting on Buddy's head. Thanks to him, Buddy stood tall, his chest heaving, but his eyes were calm as he looked up at Margaret. As the police secured the property and began their investigation, Margaret sat in her living room with Buddy by her side. Lisa arrived not long after, her face pale with worry. "Margaret, are you okay?" "I came as soon as I heard." "I'm fine," Margaret assured her. "Buddy saved me. He scared them off before they could do anything." Lisa crouched beside Buddy, stroking his fur. "You're a hero, Buddy," she said softly. Margaret smiled, her eyes filling with tears. "He's more than a hero. He's my guardian angel." Buddy wagged his tail, the tension of the night melting away as he leaned into Margaret's hand. That night, Margaret fell asleep with Buddy curled up beside her bed, his presence a reminder that she was no longer alone. The morning light broke through the curtains, casting warm golden hues over Margaret's living room. She sat at the dining table, still shaken but alive, her trembling hands cradling a mug of tea Lisa had made for her. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind like a fragmented dream. Buddy's fierce growls, the intruder's panicked retreat, and the flashing police lights outside her home. She looked down at Buddy, who lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws. His eyes, calm and steady, met hers. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Buddy wagged his tail slightly but remained still, his presence a comforting anchor in the tumult of her thoughts. Lisa, who had stayed overnight to ensure Margaret wasn't left alone, sat across from her at the table. "Margaret," she began, her voice hesitant, "we need to talk about what happened." Margaret glanced up, her expression resolute. "Lisa, I know what you're going to say. And the answer is no. Buddy's staying." Lisa sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I wasn't going to tell you to get rid of him. After last night, I wouldn't dare. But we need to make sure this doesn't happen again. What if the intruders come back?" Margaret's fingers tightened around the mug. "They won't," she said firmly. "Not after what Buddy did." Lisa nodded, though her worry remained evident. "The police are patrolling the area for now, but I'll look into getting the house better secured. Maybe a security camera or two." Margaret smiled faintly. "A security camera might be useful, but I already have the best guard dog anyone could ask for." She reached down, her fingers brushing against Buddy's fur. As the day progressed, word about the attempted break-in and Buddy's heroics spread through the small community. By afternoon, Margaret's quiet farmhouse became a hub of activity. Neighbors dropped by, their curiosity and concern mingling as they offered support. "Margaret, are you all right?" asked Mrs. Henderson, a retired schoolteacher who lived down the road. "I heard what happened. It's terrifying to think something like this could happen here." "I'm fine, Helen," Margaret assured her, gesturing toward Buddy. "This boy here made sure of that." Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened as she looked at the pitbull. "That's the dog you've been talking about?" Margaret nodded, pride evident in her voice. "His name's Buddy. He showed up at my gate, and now I know why. He was meant to be here." Helen hesitated, her gaze flickering to Buddy. "A pit bull, though? Aren't they, dangerous?" Margaret's expression hardened. "Helen, Buddy is no different from any other dog. He's loyal, protective, and kind. Last night, he risked his life for me. That's more than I can say for most people." Helen flushed, embarrassed. "I'm sorry, Margaret. You're right. He's clearly a good dog." By evening, even the local news had picked up the story. A reporter and a cameraman arrived at Margaret's home, eager to feature Buddy's heroism. "Mrs. Miller, can you tell us what happened last night?" the reporter asked, her microphone poised. Margaret, seated in her wheelchair with Buddy beside her, recounted the events with a mix of gratitude and awe. "I don't know what would have happened if Buddy hadn't been here," she said. "He didn't hesitate. He knew I was in danger, and he acted. He's not just my dog. He's my hero." The cameraman panned to Buddy, who sat calmly by Margaret's side, his head held high as if understanding the attention. That night, as the house finally quieted down, Margaret sat on the porch with Buddy. The stars glittered above, their light casting a serene glow over the fields. "You've changed everything, she said softly, her hand resting on Buddy's head. "I thought I'd spend the rest of my life alone, just waiting for the end. But now I feel like I've got a reason to keep going." Buddy wagged his tail, leaning into her touch. Margaret smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You're more than just a hero, Buddy. You're family." As the night deepened, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years: peace. For the first time in a long time, she believed that life still had something beautiful to offer, and it had come in the form of an unexpected friend with a heart as big as the fields that surrounded her home. The morning sun spilled over the horizon, casting a golden glow on Margaret's little farmhouse. Lisa had decided to stop by earlier than usual, bringing along a basket of pastries and a thermos of coffee. She was still concerned after the events of the break-in, but a part of her was curious about how Margaret and Buddy were faring in the aftermath. When Lisa pulled into the driveway, she was greeted by an unusual sight. Buddy standing proudly on the porch, tail wagging, as Margaret watered her daisies from her wheelchair. The two of them looked so at ease, so in sync, that Lisa couldn't help but smile as she approached. "Well, don't you two look like a team?" Lisa teased, stepping onto the porch. Margaret chuckled, lowering her watering can. That's because we are. Good morning, Lisa. Buddy trotted over to Lisa, sniffing at the basket she carried before sitting obediently at her feet. His behavior surprised her. Despite her initial reservations about Buddy, she had to admit he was nothing like the aggressive stereotype often associated with his breed. I brought breakfast, Lisa said, holding up the basket. Thought you could use a treat after everything that's happened. Margaret's face softened. That's sweet of you, dear. Let's sit out here. It's too nice a day to be inside. The two women settled on the porch, sipping coffee and nibbling on pastries while Buddy lounged at Margaret's side. It wasn't long before a few neighbors began passing by, their curiosity about Buddy and the previous night's events drawing them closer. The first to stop was Jim, a retired postal worker who lived a few houses down. He tipped his hat as he approached. Morning, Margaret. Heard you had some excitement the other night. Margaret gave a wry smile. You could say that. Come meet the hero who scared off those intruders. Jim's eyes widened as he noticed Buddy. That's the dog everyone's talking about? That's him, Margaret said proudly. Buddy here didn't think twice about protecting me. Jim scratched his head. A pit bull, huh? I have to admit, I didn't think they were the friendly type. Margaret's smile faded slightly, but her voice remained calm. He's as friendly as any other dog when treated right. It's people who give them a bad name, not their nature. Buddy seemed to sense the tension in Margaret's tone. He stood and wagged his tail, taking a step toward Jim. The man hesitated before reaching out to pat Buddy's head. Well, I'll be, Jim muttered. He's a good boy. Better than good, Margaret replied firmly. Soon, more neighbors began stopping by, drawn by the buzz surrounding Buddy. Mrs. Henderson brought over a pie, while a young mother with her toddler came to see the dog who saved Mrs. Miller. The child, a little girl with pigtails, clutched a bright red ball as she shyly approached Buddy. Can I pet him? She asked, her big eyes looking up at Margaret. Of course, dear, Margaret said with a smile. Buddy loves kids. The little girl giggled as Buddy sniffed her hand, his tail wagging enthusiastically. When her ball slipped from her grasp and rolled off the porch, Buddy immediately retrieved it, carrying it back gently in his mouth. The girl squealed with delight. Thank you, Buddy. The sight melted away whatever reservations the neighbors might have had about the dog. Slowly but surely, their perceptions began to shift, and Buddy went from being that pit bull to Margaret's amazing dog. As the day wound down and the last of the visitors left, Lisa turned to Margaret with an amused look. You know, Margaret, I think Buddy might be more popular than you now. Margaret laughed, patting Buddy's head. He's earned it. But he's still my dog, first and foremost. Lisa smiled, her expression softening. I'm glad he found you. Or maybe you found each other. Margaret looked at Buddy, her heart swelling with affection. I think you're right, Lisa. He came to me when I needed him most. And now, I can't imagine life without him. As the sun set, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Margaret and Buddy sat on the porch, side by side. They had faced fear and uncertainty together, and now, they were not just a woman and her dog. They were a team, a family. Buddy had quickly become the talk of the town. Margaret's neighbors, who once exchanged polite but distant greetings, now regularly stopped by to check in on her, and, more often than not, to see Buddy. The dog had become a symbol of courage and loyalty, but his integration into the community was not without its challenges. It was a warm Saturday morning when Margaret decided to take Buddy to the local park. Lisa had encouraged her to get some fresh air, and Margaret figured Buddy could use the exercise. Lisa helped her load her wheelchair into the back of her car, and soon, the pair arrived at the small park on the edge of town. The park was alive with the sounds of children laughing, birds chirping, and families chatting under shady trees. Buddy's ears perked up as he surveyed the bustling scene, his tail wagging cautiously. Margaret wheeled herself along the paved path, Buddy walking faithfully by her side. At first, the sight of a pit bull caused some parents to pull their children closer, their whispers barely concealed. Isn't that Mrs. Miller's dog? Yes, but it's a pit bull. You have to be careful with those. Margaret heard the murmurs and felt a pang of frustration. She stopped her wheelchair and called Buddy to her side. Buddy, she said firmly, looking into his calm amber eyes. "Let's show them who you really are." Buddy wagged his tail and nuzzled her hand, as if understanding her resolve. They stopped near a group of children playing with a soccer ball. One of the boys accidentally kicked the ball too hard, sending it rolling toward Margaret and Buddy. Buddy sprang into action, bounding after the ball and stopping it with his paw. He nudged it back toward the children, his tail wagging eagerly. The children hesitated, glancing toward their parents, who were watching warily. But when Buddy sat down and tilted his head in a playful gesture, the tension broke. "Can he play with us?" one of the boys asked, running up to Margaret. Margaret smiled. "He'd love to." The children quickly warmed up to Buddy, tossing the ball back and forth as he ran after it, his powerful legs propelling him across the grass. His gentleness with the smaller kids didn't go unnoticed. Soon, parents who had kept their distance began to approach. One mother, holding a toddler on her hip, walked over to Margaret. "I have to admit, I was nervous when I saw him, but he's not what I expected." Margaret nodded, her tone even. "He's nothing like the stories you hear. He's brave, loyal, and kind. I've never felt safer with anyone." The mother smiled faintly. "Looks like the kids adore him." Margaret glanced toward the group of children, who were now laughing as Buddy rolled onto his back, inviting belly rubs. Her heart swelled with pride. Over the weeks that followed, Buddy's reputation grew. He became a fixture at the park, where families greeted him warmly and children eagerly asked to play. He also accompanied Margaret to the farmer's market, where vendors would slip him treats, and to Sunday services, where even the pastor commented on his calming presence. But not everyone was immediately won over. One afternoon, while Margaret and Buddy were walking through the neighborhood, a man named Greg stopped them. Greg was known for being outspoken, and he didn't hesitate to voice his concerns. "That dog of yours," Greg began, crossing his arms. "He's a pitbull, right? You know those dogs can turn on you in an instant." Margaret met his gaze evenly. "Buddy hasn't turned on me, Greg. In fact, he saved my life. And he's done nothing but prove how loving he is since the day he showed up." Greg scoffed. "You're lucky, that's all. I just don't trust them." Before Margaret could reply, Buddy stepped forward, his tail wagging slightly. He sat at Greg's feet and looked up at him, his eyes soft and inviting. Greg shifted uncomfortably, but didn't move away. "Looks like he trusts you, Greg," Margaret said, her tone pointed. Greg hesitated, then slowly reached down to pat Buddy's head. "Well, maybe he's one of the good ones," he muttered before walking off. Margaret sighed but smiled. "We'll win him over eventually," she said to Buddy, who wagged his tail in agreement. By the end of the month, Buddy had become a beloved member of the community. His playful yet gentle nature, combined with his extraordinary loyalty, had softened even the most skeptical hearts. For Margaret, Buddy wasn't just a dog. He was proof that life could still hold surprises, even when you least expected them. Sitting on her porch one evening, Margaret watched Buddy chase fireflies in the fading light. She smiled, her heart full. "You've done more for me than I ever could have imagined," she said aloud. "And I think you're doing the same for everyone else." Buddy paused, his eyes meeting hers before he trotted back to her side, resting his head on her lap. Together, they watched the fireflies dance, their bond stronger than ever. The days grew longer as summer settled into Margaret's little town. Life had taken on a new rhythm since Buddy's arrival. Margaret found herself more active, more engaged, and more at peace than she'd been in years. Buddy's constant presence provided her with a sense of security and comfort, but there was something deeper, something almost unexplainable about the connection they shared. One warm afternoon, Margaret sat in her garden, a patch of daisies blooming brightly at her side. She had taken to spending her afternoons here, tending to the flowers with Buddy lying nearby. The rhythmic sound of her trowel digging into the soil was accompanied by the occasional chirping of birds. Buddy, ever watchful, perked up his ears at the faint rustle of the wind. Margaret sighed, leaning back in her chair and wiping her brow. "You know, Buddy," she began, her voice soft, "these daisies were John's favorite. He used to plant them for me every spring. Said they reminded him of my smile." Buddy turned his head toward her, his gaze steady and patient. It was as if he understood the weight of her words, the memories tied to them. That evening, Margaret went through an old wooden box she kept in her closet. Inside were remnants of her life with John. Photographs, letters, and keepsakes. She held a picture of John in his Navy uniform, his arm draped around a much younger version of herself. A pang of longing swept through her, but it was accompanied by a warm sense of gratitude for the life they had shared. Buddy lay at her feet, his presence grounding her. Margaret placed the photo on the small table beside her and reached down to stroke Buddy's fur. "You know, Max used to sit just like this," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "He was always so attentive, like you. Sometimes, when I look at you, I see a bit of him. It's silly, isn't it?" Buddy nuzzled her hand, as if reassuring her that it wasn't silly at all. As Margaret's Alzheimer's progressed, there were days when her memories felt like pieces of a puzzle, scattered and incomplete. But Buddy had an uncanny way of bringing clarity. When she became confused or anxious, Buddy would sit by her side, his calm demeanor anchoring her. One day, while sorting through some old photographs, Margaret came across a picture of Max as a puppy. She held it up, her eyes filling with tears. "Max," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You were such a good boy." Buddy, sensing her emotions, rested his head on her lap. Margaret looked down at him, her tears spilling over. "You're helping me remember him," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And John, it's like you're a bridge between my past and my present." Margaret shared these moments with Lisa, who had grown increasingly impressed by the bond between the two. One evening, as Lisa helped Margaret prepare dinner, she broached the subject. "You know, Margaret," Lisa began, "I've worked with a lot of people in situations like yours, and I've never seen anything quite like what you and Buddy have. It's like he knows exactly what you need." Margaret nodded, her eyes softening. "He's more than just a dog, Lisa. He's a piece of my heart I didn't know I was missing." Lisa smiled, her own eyes misting. "Well, he's certainly a blessing. And he's not just helping you. He's teaching all of us a thing or two about love and loyalty." That night, as Margaret sat on her porch with Buddy at her side, she gazed at the stars. The vast expanse of the night sky reminded her of the many nights she had spent sitting here with John, sharing stories and dreams. She reached down to Buddy, her fingers brushing against his fur. "You're part of this family now," she said softly, "and you're helping me hold onto the parts of myself that I thought were gone." Buddy looked up at her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. In that moment, Margaret felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Buddy wasn't just a protector or a companion. He was a reminder that love, in all its forms, could transcend time and loss. Margaret's little farmhouse had become something of a local landmark. People often passed by just to catch a glimpse of Buddy, the dog who had not only saved Margaret but also warmed the hearts of an entire community. For a small town like theirs, Buddy's story wasn't just news. It was an ongoing reminder of loyalty and courage. One sunny Saturday morning, Margaret and Buddy ventured to the park again, this time accompanied by Lisa. The park was bustling with families, joggers, and dog walkers. Buddy, with his bright blue collar and calm demeanor, walked confidently beside Margaret's wheelchair. It was a sight that had become familiar to the locals. As they made their way to a shaded bench, a group of children rushed over, waving and calling out. "Hi, Buddy," a young girl shouted, clutching a frisbee. Her little brother followed, holding a small bag of treats. Margaret chuckled. "Buddy, I think your fan club is here." The children giggled as Buddy wagged his tail and sniffed their outstretched hands. He accepted a treat from the boy and then sat politely, his head cocked to one side as if asking for more. One of the parents, a man named Tom, approached Margaret. He had been one of the neighbors who initially voiced concerns about Buddy's breed. Now, his tone was warm and admiring. "Mrs. Miller," Tom began, tipping his baseball cap, "I have to admit, I was wrong about Buddy. He's got a heart of gold." Margaret smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "It's not about the breed, Tom. It's about how you treat them. Buddy's shown me more kindness and courage than I could have ever imagined." Tom nodded thoughtfully, patting Buddy on the head. "You're absolutely right. He's something special." As the morning unfolded, Buddy's reputation as the town's gentle hero grew stronger. A young boy with autism, who usually shied away from dogs, approached cautiously. His mother, standing nearby, looked nervous but hopeful. Margaret noticed and beckoned the boy forward. "Buddy's very gentle, sweetheart. Would you like to pet him?" The boy hesitated, then slowly reached out a hand. Buddy remained perfectly still, his eyes soft and patient. When the boy finally touched him, a smile broke across his face, and his mother's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," the woman said quietly to Margaret. "He's never done that before." Margaret's voice was kind. "Buddy has a way of making people feel safe. He's done that for me, too." Later that afternoon, as Margaret and Lisa prepared to leave, a local reporter approached them. She had been following Buddy's story since the break-in and wanted to feature him in an upcoming piece about community resilience. "Mrs. Miller," the reporter said, adjusting her camera strap, "do you think Buddy's story has changed the way people view pit bulls?" Margaret glanced down at Buddy, who was lying at her feet. "I think Buddy's story has changed the way people view a lot of things," she replied. "He's reminded us that love and loyalty come in all forms, and that sometimes the most unexpected bonds are the strongest." The reporter smiled. "That's beautiful, Mrs. Miller. I couldn't have said it better myself." By the time they returned home, Margaret was exhausted but happy. She parked her wheelchair by the porch and let Buddy roam the yard. As she watched him chase a butterfly, she thought about how much had changed since he'd entered her life. The isolation she'd once felt had been replaced by a sense of connection, not just to Buddy, but to the community as well. Her neighbors no longer saw her as the reclusive old lady at the end of the road. She was now Buddy's owner, a title she wore with pride. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Margaret sat on the porch with Buddy beside her. The soft hum of crickets filled the air, and the first stars began to appear in the sky. "You've done so much for me, Buddy," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've brought me back to life. And you've brought this whole community together." Buddy looked up at her, his tail thumping against the porch. Margaret reached down to stroke his fur, her heart full of gratitude and love. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Buddy wagged his tail, as if to say, "You're welcome." The summer had rolled gently into autumn, and with it came a crispness in the air that Margaret always found invigorating. Life had taken on a steady, peaceful rhythm in her little farmhouse. Buddy had become not just her companion, but her protector, her friend, and her inspiration. Margaret often reflected on how her days had transformed from lonely monotony into a rich tapestry of small joys and meaningful connections. One afternoon, Margaret sat in her living room, a quilt draped over her lap. Buddy lay at her feet, his ears twitching occasionally at the sound of leaves rustling outside. Margaret held a letter in her hands, one she had written but hadn't yet sealed. It was addressed to her children, who lived in different states and hadn't visited in years. "Do you think they'll come, Buddy?" she asked, her voice filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. Buddy lifted his head, his expressive eyes meeting hers as if to say, "Of course they will." Margaret smiled and set the letter aside. "You always know how to reassure me, don't you?" A week later, her son Michael called. It was a rare occurrence, but his voice was warm and eager. "Mom, I got your letter," he said. "I can't believe I let so much time pass without visiting. I'm coming up this weekend. An ally's coming with me." Margaret's heart swelled. "Oh, Michael, that would mean the world to me." The weekend arrived with a flurry of activity. Michael and Ally, Margaret's granddaughter, pulled into the driveway late Saturday morning. Margaret was on the porch with Buddy at her side, her hands gripping the wheels of her chair tightly as she fought back tears. "Grandma!" Ally shouted as she leaped out of the car and ran to hug Margaret. Michael followed, his face a mixture of joy and guilt. "Mom," he said softly, bending down to embrace her. "I'm sorry it's been so long." Margaret shook her head, her voice firm but kind. "You're here now, and that's what matters." Ally crouched down to pet Buddy, who wagged his tail enthusiastically. "Is this Buddy?" she asked, her eyes wide with excitement. "That's him," Margaret said proudly. "He's my guardian angel." Over the course of the weekend, Michael and Ally learned more about Buddy's heroics, his bond with Margaret, and the profound impact he'd had on her life. Michael, who had once been skeptical of pit bulls, found himself marveling at Buddy's gentle nature and unwavering loyalty. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, Michael turned to his mother. "Mom, I don't know how you managed all this time by yourself, but now I see. You weren't really alone, were you?" Margaret smiled, her eyes glistening. "Buddy has been my rock, but it's not just him. Since he came into my life, I've reconnected with so many people, neighbors, the community, and now, you." Michael reached across the table and took her hand. "We won't let so much time pass again, Mom. I promise." When Sunday came, and it was time for Michael and Ally to leave, Margaret felt a bittersweet pang in her heart. But she knew this wasn't goodbye. They had rekindled their bond, and she was certain they would return soon. After waving them off, Margaret wheeled herself back onto the porch. Buddy followed, lying down beside her with a contented sigh. "They're coming back," she said softly, looking down at him. "You've done more than save me, Buddy. You've brought my family back to me." Buddy wagged his tail, his gaze fixed on the horizon as the sun began to set. In the weeks that followed, Margaret felt a renewed sense of purpose. She began writing more letters, not just to her family, but also to old friends she hadn't spoken to in years. The community, inspired by Buddy's story, started a fundraiser to install a new wheelchair ramp for her porch and to help other elderly residents in the area with home repairs. Margaret's home, once a symbol of isolation, had become a hub of connection and kindness. And at the center of it all was Buddy, a dog who had wandered into her life when she needed him most and transformed it in ways she never could have imagined. One crisp autumn evening, as Margaret sat on the porch with a blanket draped over her legs, she looked out at the fields bathed in the golden light of dusk. She rested a hand on Buddy's head, her heart full. "This," she said quietly, "this is the happiest I've been in years. And it's all thanks to you." Buddy leaned into her touch, his tail wagging slowly. Together, they watched the sun dip below the horizon, the promise of tomorrow stretching out before them. Margaret smiled. She wasn't afraid of what lay ahead, not with Buddy by her side. For the first time in a long time, she felt whole. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and watch this next story. It's incredibly touching.